I pulled the headphones snug over my ears and watched the depth gauge tick past 4,000 meters. The familiar weight of the acoustic monitoring equipment felt reassuring against my shoulders as numbers continued climbing on the display. 4,050, 4,100, 4,150. Each meter took us deeper into the Puerto Rico Trench, where few humans had ever ventured. The Echo 1's cockpit wrapped around us like a mechanical cocoon, barely wide enough for two people, and packed with instrument panels, screens, and control systems. Every surface served a purpose. The steady hum of life support systems created a constant backdrop. Circulation fans, pressure regulators, and oxygen scrubbers working in perfect harmony to keep us alive in this metal bubble thousands of meters below the surface. Elias sat in the pilot's seat beside me, his hands moving across the controls with 15 years of practiced ease. His fingers found switches and dials without him even looking, adjusting our descent rate with tiny corrections to the ballast system. I'd worked with him on 6 previous deep-sea missions, and his competence still impressed me. The man could pilot a submersible through a needle if you asked him to. "Passing 4,200, he announced, glancing at the navigation display. "Descent rate holding steady at 12 meters per minute." I checked my own screens and nodded. The acoustic equipment showed green lights across the board, hydrophone arrays online, signal processors calibrated, recording systems ready. My fingers moved through the pre-survey checklist I'd memorized years ago, though I still ran through each item methodically. In 15 years of marine acoustics research, I'd learned that routine procedures kept you alive down here. "Temperature's dropping fast outside," Elias commented, watching the environmental readouts. "We're hitting that thermocline layer right on schedule." The water temperature had plummeted from 8 degrees Celsius to just above freezing as we passed through the boundary between water masses. Outside our tiny porthole, the darkness was absolute. Our lights could penetrate maybe 30 meters into the black water, illuminating nothing but marine snow, tiny particles drifting past like a gentle blizzard. I powered up the sonar system and watched the display come alive with baseline readings. Acoustic systems are green, ready to begin ping sequence on your mark. "Roger that," Elias said, making a final adjustment to our position. "Take us to 5,200 meters and we'll start the survey." The Puerto Rico Trench stretched beneath us like a wound in the ocean floor, one of the deepest places on Earth. Our mission was straightforward: map the acoustic properties of the trench walls as part of a larger geological survey. The data would help scientists understand how sound traveled through these extreme depths, information crucial for everything from earthquake monitoring to submarine navigation. Elias maintained our descent with small adjustments to the trim, his eyes scanning multiple displays simultaneously. "You know what I love most about these deep runs?" he asked, settling back in his seat. "The complete and total quiet. No ship traffic, no biologics, no interference. Just us and the rock." I smiled and pulled up the survey parameters on my screen. "Speak for yourself. I'm about to fill this quiet with enough acoustic energy to wake up every deep-sea creature for 50 kilometers. "Right. Forgot you're the noisy one in this partnership." He gestured at the cramped space around us. "Good thing we like each other, considering we're stuck in a tin can the size of a phone booth for the next 8 hours." The cockpit really was ridiculously small. Our shoulders nearly touched when we both leaned forward, and there was barely enough room to stretch our legs. Every piece of equipment had been designed for maximum efficiency in minimum space. Storage compartments held emergency supplies, spare parts, and our personal gear in precisely organized chaos. The designers had somehow managed to cram everything 2 people needed to survive in the deep ocean into a space smaller than most bathroom stalls. "Could be worse," I said, checking the hydrophone array one more time. At least you shower regularly." "That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me, Anya." Our banter helped ease the psychological pressure of the descent. 4,000 meters of water pressed against our hull with crushing force, held back by engineering and materials science that still amazed me. The pressure outside was over 400 times greater than at sea level, enough to compress a human body instantly if our protection failed. I pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the mission. The depth gauge showed 5,100 meters and still dropping. Approaching target depth, beginning equipment final check. The sonar system responded perfectly to my commands. I ran a quick diagnostic on each hydrophone in the array, watching as green indicators confirmed proper function. The acoustic processors showed optimal calibration, and the recording systems had plenty of storage space for the data we'd collect over the next several hours. 5,200 meters, Elias announced. "Leveling off now." He brought us to neutral buoyancy with subtle adjustments to the ballast tanks. The submarine's descent slowed and stopped, leaving us hovering in the water column like a mechanical fish. Our lights illuminated empty water in all directions, though I knew the seafloor lay somewhere below us in the darkness. "Perfect position," I said, watching our coordinates lock in on the navigation system. Initiating first sonar ping sequence. I activated the acoustic system and sent the first pulse into the depths. The sound wave traveled downward at roughly 1,500 meters per second, carrying carefully calibrated frequencies that would reveal the structure of whatever lay beneath us. My headphones picked up the outgoing ping, a brief, powerful tone that cut through the water and vanished into the abyss. Seconds later, the echo returned, painting the first details of the seafloor on my display. Rocky formations appeared as bright spots against the darker background, their shapes revealing the complex geology of the trench walls. The return signal looked clean and strong, exactly what I'd expected from this depth. "Beautiful returns," I told Elias, adjusting the display contrast for better resolution. "We're getting excellent penetration through the water column." He leaned over to look at my screen, careful not to interfere with the controls. "Looks like textbook acoustic propagation. No interference, no distortion. This is what deep water surveys should look like." I sent out another ping, this time with a slightly different frequency, to build a more complete picture. The echo came back just as clean, filling in more details of the seafloor topology. Ridge formations became visible, along with what looked like a series of steep drop-offs that marked the trench's deepest sections. "I'm seeing some interesting geological features," I said, pointing to specific areas on the display. "These ridge formations suggest significant tectonic activity in the past. The acoustic shadows indicate steep walls, probably near vertical in some places." Elias nodded, making notes on his own clipboard. "Matches what the bathymetric surveys predicted. We're sitting right on top of one of the most geologically active areas in the Caribbean." The routine felt familiar and comforting. Send a ping, analyze the return, adjust parameters, send another ping. I'd conducted hundreds of similar surveys over my career, each one building our understanding of the ocean's hidden topography. The deep sea remained one of the least explored regions on Earth, and every acoustic pulse added new pieces to the puzzle. "Beginning systematic survey pattern," I announced, settling into the rhythm that would define the next several hours. "Starting with the western wall and working our way across the trench floor." The survey proceeded exactly as planned. Each acoustic pulse returned clear, detailed information about the seafloor structure. I documented ridge formations, measured the depths of various geological features, and built a comprehensive acoustic map of our survey area. The equipment performed flawlessly, the environmental conditions were perfect, and our position remained stable in the water column. Elias maintained our location with occasional adjustments to the thrusters, keeping us precisely where we needed to be for optimal acoustic coverage. His piloting skills made my job easier, providing the stable platform necessary for accurate measurements. An hour into the survey, I had collected enough data to fill several research papers. The acoustic returns painted a detailed picture of ancient geological processes, showing how tectonic forces had shaped this part of the ocean floor over millions of years. Everything functioned exactly as it should, delivering the kind of clean, professional results that made deep-sea research successful. Data quality is exceptional, I told Elias, reviewing the collected information on my screens. We're getting exactly what the mission planners hoped for. I sent out another ping and watched the return paint more details across my display. The acoustic signature remained clean and strong, building an increasingly detailed map of the trench's geological features. Ridge formations appeared as bright lines against the darker background, their angles revealing the complex forces that had shaped this part of the ocean floor over millions of years. Moving to grid position 2, I announced, adjusting the survey parameters on my screen. Beginning second sweep of the western wall. Elias made subtle corrections to our position, the thrusters responding with barely perceptible adjustments. Our submarine held steady in the water column, while I continued the methodical process of acoustic mapping. Each ping revealed new information about the seafloor structure, the data accumulating into what would become a comprehensive geological survey of this section of the Puerto Rico Trench. The routine felt comfortable and predictable. Send acoustic pulse, analyze return, document findings, move to next grid position. I'd conducted this exact type of survey dozens of times over my career, and the familiar rhythm of scientific data collection helped pass the time in our cramped cockpit. 20 minutes into the survey, I noticed something wrong with the returns. The sonar ping came back with perfect clarity, but the timing made no sense. I stared at my display, running quick calculations in my head. Sound travels at roughly 1,500 meters per second underwater, and we were positioned about 200 meters above the seafloor based on our bathymetric readings. The return should take roughly 0.3 of a second to travel down and back up. This echo had returned instantly. I checked the depth readings again, confirming our position in the water column. The seafloor lay 200 meters below us according to all navigation instruments, but the acoustic return showed no travel time whatsoever. The ping went out and came back in the same millisecond. Elias, take a look at this. I pointed to the timing display on my screen. Something's not right with these returns. He leaned over to examine the data, his brow creasing as he studied the numbers. What am I looking at? The echo timing. We're getting instantaneous returns from what should be a 200-meter round trip. I pulled up the previous several pings and showed him the pattern. Every single one comes back with 0 delay. Elias studied the display more carefully, his expression growing skeptical. Equipment malfunction? I ran a quick diagnostic on the hydrophone array, watching as green lights confirmed proper function across all systems. The acoustic processors showed optimal calibration, and the timing circuits tested within normal parameters. Everything indicated the equipment was working perfectly. Diagnostics are clean, I reported, feeling increasingly puzzled. All systems show normal operation. I programmed another ping with slightly different parameters and sent it into the water. The pulse traveled outward at its normal speed. I could track its propagation through the water column on my display. But when the return arrived, it came back with that same impossible timing. 0 delay. Perfect amplitude matching. The physics didn't work. Sound waves can't travel instantaneously through water, and they certainly can't maintain perfect amplitude when bouncing off solid surfaces. Energy dissipates, Frequencies scatter. Timing delays accumulate based on distance traveled. These were fundamental principles of acoustic science that I'd built my entire career around. Yet my instruments were recording returns that violated every rule of sound propagation. I sent out another ping, this time watching the exact millisecond timing on my most precise instruments. The acoustic pulse left our submarine, traveled outward through the water, and then nothing. No delay, no attenuation. The return signal appeared on my screen with identical characteristics to the outgoing pulse. "This is impossible," I muttered, checking the calibration settings again. "Sound doesn't behave this way." Elias reviewed the navigation data on his screen. "We're definitely where we think we are. Depth readings are consistent. Position holds steady. Maybe the acoustic equipment picked up some kind of interference." I ran another diagnostic, this time testing individual components of the sonar system. The hydrophones tested normal. The signal processors showed proper function. The timing circuits operated within specified tolerances. Even the power supply delivered clean, stable current to all acoustic systems. But the returns kept coming back with perfect timing and amplitude. I pulled up the acoustic signature analysis and studied the waveform patterns. The outgoing ping showed the expected characteristics: frequency spread, amplitude modulation, normal signal decay as it traveled through water. The return signal looked like a perfect copy of the original pulse before it had traveled anywhere. "It's like the sound is bouncing off something right next to us," I said, scrolling through more data. "But there's nothing out there." Elias activated the external cameras and swept our lights through the water in all directions. Empty ocean stretched in every direction, illuminated only by marine snow drifting past our viewports. No other vessels. No geological formations. No biological masses that could explain the acoustic anomaly. I programmed a different frequency and sent it out, hoping to isolate the source of the problem. The ping traveled through the water with normal propagation characteristics, but the return came back instantly with that same perfect clarity. My scientific training demanded systematic investigation. I documented each anomalous return, recording the exact timing, amplitude, and frequency characteristics. The pattern remained consistent. Every ping returned with zero delay and no signal degradation. 15 years of acoustic research, I said, saving another set of measurements. I've never seen anything like this. The impossibility of it gnawed at my analytical mind. Sound waves follow predictable patterns based on well-understood physics. They can't travel faster than their propagation speed through a medium, and they can't maintain perfect amplitude when reflecting off distant surfaces. Yet my instruments were recording exactly those impossible characteristics. I tried adjusting the ping intensity, thinking perhaps the signal was somehow creating interference with itself. The returns maintained their impossible timing regardless of power levels. I tested different frequency ranges, from low rumbles to high-pitched chirps. Every pulse came back with identical timing anomalies. "Equipment has to be malfunctioning," Elias said, though he sounded uncertain, "even if the diagnostics can't detect it." I wanted to agree with him, but the diagnostic systems were comprehensive. If any component of the acoustic array was failing, the self-monitoring systems would detect and report the problem. Every test showed normal operation. More troubling was the consistency of the anomaly. Equipment failures typically produced random errors, inconsistent readings, or progressive degradation. These returns showed perfect consistency. Every ping returned with identical timing and amplitude characteristics. I began documenting everything methodically, recording each ping sequence and its impossible results. The data might not make physical sense, but it was real and measurable. Whatever was causing these returns deserved careful scientific investigation. Maintaining current position. Elias announced, checking our location coordinates. "Systems are stable. Navigation holds steady." I sent out another ping and watched as it returned with that same impossible perfection. The acoustic signature showed no degradation, no frequency shift, no time delay that should occur when sound travels through water and reflects off solid surfaces. The returns weren't coming from the seafloor at all. They were originating from somewhere much closer, somewhere in the empty water column surrounding our submarine. I stared at the acoustic display, watching another ping return with that same impossible perfection. 3 hours had passed since we first noticed the anomaly, and nothing we'd tried had changed the pattern. Every sonar pulse came back exactly as transmitted. No frequency shift, no amplitude loss, no time delay that should exist when sound travels through water and bounces off distant surfaces. The cramped cockpit had become a laboratory as we systematically tested every component of our acoustic systems. I'd run comprehensive diagnostics on each hydrophone array, checking calibration matrices and signal processing algorithms. Elias had powered down and restarted the main sonar computer twice, while I monitored the restart sequences for any indication of corrupted data or hardware failure. Nothing showed problems. Every system operated within normal parameters. I pulled up the equipment logs on my secondary screen and scrolled through 3 hours of technical data. The hydrophones maintained perfect sensitivity across all frequency ranges. The signal processors showed consistent performance with no drift or instability. Even the power supply delivered clean current without fluctuation or noise. "Let's try isolating the primary hydrophone array," I suggested, configuring the acoustic system to use only our backup sensors. "Maybe there's crosstalk between the main and secondary arrays." Elias nodded and helped me switch the connections, his movements methodical but tense. He'd grown increasingly uncomfortable as the afternoon wore on, checking and rechecking systems that had already proven themselves functional. I sent another ping using only the backup hydrophones. The pulse traveled outward through the water column, and the return came back with identical characteristics: perfect amplitude, 0 time delay, exact frequency matching. Whatever was causing the anomaly affected all our acoustic equipment equally. "Same result," I reported, saving the data to our mission logs. "The backup array shows identical behavior. We'd tested for electromagnetic interference by powering down our navigation computers and non-essential electronics. The acoustic anomaly continued unchanged. I'd programmed different pulse patterns, short chirps, long tones, frequency sweeps, and every variation returned with impossible perfection. The physics bothered me more than the technical mystery. Sound waves couldn't travel instantaneously through water. They couldn't maintain perfect amplitude when reflecting off surfaces. These were fundamental principles I'd built my career around, yet our instruments were recording exactly those impossible characteristics. I brought up the theoretical acoustic propagation models on my screen and compared them with our actual returns. The models predicted sound travel times of approximately 0.3 of a second for the round trip to the seafloor at our current depth. Our returns showed 0 travel time. The sound appeared to bounce back before it had time to reach anything. "There has to be a logical explanation," I muttered, reviewing the data for patterns we might have missed. "Maybe a unique thermal layer creating some kind of acoustic mirror effect." Elias shook his head, adjusting our position with small thruster corrections. "Thermal layers don't work that way, Anya. They can bend sound waves or create shadow zones, but they can't eliminate travel time." I knew he was right, but my scientific training demanded systematic investigation of every possibility. I pulled up environmental data from our descent and examined the temperature gradients we'd encountered. The thermocline at 4,000 meters had shown normal characteristics, a predictable boundary between water masses with different temperatures and densities. What about an undiscovered geological formation? I proposed, thinking through the alternatives. Something massive and vertical that we can't see on our cameras but creates perfect acoustic reflection. At 200 meters away, Elias gestured toward our depth readings. We'd need a wall of rock positioned exactly perpendicular to our sonar beam, and it would have to be perfectly smooth to maintain signal coherence. The geological explanation felt weak even as I suggested it. Natural rock formations didn't create perfect acoustic mirrors. They scattered sound waves, created multiple reflection paths, and introduced frequency distortions. Our returns showed none of those characteristics. I programmed another test, this time using multiple frequency bands simultaneously to build a more complete acoustic picture. The complex waveform traveled outward and returned instantly with every frequency component intact. No natural geological surface could maintain such precise coherence across multiple acoustic bands. Maybe a biological target, I suggested, grasping for explanations that fit within known science. A massive school of fish arranged in perfect formation, dense enough to create coherent reflection. Elias activated our external cameras and swept our lights through the surrounding water. Marine snow drifted past our viewports in the characteristic patterns of deep ocean currents, but we saw no biological activity. No fish schools, no large organisms, no biomass that could explain the acoustic returns. "Nothing out there," he reported, returning the cameras to their forward position. "Just empty water in every direction." The isolation of our position struck me as we floated in the absolute darkness of the deep ocean. We were suspended in a liquid void, thousands of meters from the nearest solid surface, yet something was returning our acoustic signals with impossible precision. I decided to contact the surface support vessel for guidance. The acoustic modem allowed communication through the water column, though the data transmission rate was limited and the connection sometimes unreliable at extreme depths. "Surface control, this is Echo 1, I transmitted, keeping the message brief to preserve our limited bandwidth. "Experiencing technical anomaly with acoustic systems. Request guidance." The response took several minutes to arrive, the low-frequency signals propagating slowly through the water column. Dr. Patterson's voice came through the underwater telephone system with the characteristic distortion of deep-water communication. "Echo 1, this is Patterson. Describe the nature of your technical issue." I explained the acoustic anomaly in technical terms, describing the impossible return characteristics and our diagnostic efforts. The underwater communication system limited our conversation to short exchanges, separated by transmission delays, making detailed discussion difficult. "Continue monitoring the anomaly." Patterson's response finally came through. "Extreme depth conditions can cause sensor malfunctions we haven't encountered in shallower water. Maintain current position and document all observations." His suggestion made practical sense. We were operating at depths where few submersibles had ever ventured, pushing our equipment beyond its normal operational envelope. Unknown environmental factors could potentially cause sensor behavior that seemed impossible from our limited perspective. Yet the precision of the anomaly troubled me. Equipment malfunctions typically produced random errors, inconsistent readings, or progressive degradation. Our acoustic return showed perfect consistency. Every ping returned with identical, impossible characteristics. I sent another pulse into the water and watched as it came back with flawless timing and amplitude. The return signal looked like a perfect copy of our original transmission, showing no evidence of the energy loss, frequency dispersion, or timing delays that occurred when sound waves traveled through water and reflected off solid surfaces. 15 years of acoustic research, I said, adjusting the display parameters to examine the waveform more closely. "I've never seen returns like this." Elias checked our ballast and position systems for the dozenth time. his movements betraying increasing anxiety. Something feels wrong about this whole situation. The returns, the precision, the way everything stays exactly the same. I understood his discomfort, but my scientific curiosity was stronger than my unease. The phenomenon represented something genuinely new in underwater acoustics, and the data we were collecting could contribute to our understanding of sound propagation in extreme environments. "We're documenting something unprecedented," I said, saving another set of measurements to our research database. These returns challenge our basic understanding of acoustic physics. The impossibility of it fascinated me. Every fundamental principle of underwater acoustics suggested that what we were observing couldn't happen. Sound waves required time to travel through water. They lost energy when reflecting off surfaces. They experienced frequency shifts based on relative motion and environmental conditions. Our returns violated every one of those principles. I programmed a more complex acoustic test, sending out a carefully structured sequence of tones designed to reveal the nature of whatever was creating the perfect reflections. The multi-frequency pattern traveled outward into the darkness and returned instantly with every component intact. The precision was absolute. No natural phenomenon could maintain such perfect acoustic coherence across multiple frequency bands while eliminating all travel time. Even the most sophisticated human-made acoustic mirrors would introduce minute timing variations or amplitude changes. Whatever was returning our signals possessed capabilities that exceeded both natural physics and current technology. Elias shifted in his seat, checking our emergency ascent systems. "How much longer do we stay down here? This anomaly isn't getting any clearer, and frankly, it's making me nervous." I looked at the time display and realized how long we'd been investigating the phenomenon. The afternoon had passed while we ran diagnostic after diagnostic, each test confirming the impossible nature of our acoustic returns. "Just a few more tests," I said, programming another sequence. "We need to gather enough data to understand what we're dealing with." The scientific opportunity was too valuable to abandon. Whatever was causing the acoustic anomaly represented a genuine mystery that could reshape our understanding of underwater sound propagation. The data we collected might provide insights that wouldn't be available anywhere else on Earth. But as I sent another ping into the darkness and watched it return with perfect, impossible timing, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with something far beyond our current scientific understanding. Something that was catching our acoustic signals and throwing them back to us with a precision that shouldn't exist in the natural world. I pulled up our mission timeline and realized we'd been down here for over 6 hours. The afternoon had passed in what felt like minutes as we investigated the impossible acoustic returns. But according to our dive schedule, evening was approaching on the surface far above us. The familiar routines of daylight and darkness meant nothing at this depth, where perpetual night surrounded our small bubble of artificial light. My scientific curiosity had sustained me through hours of testing, but practical considerations were becoming harder to ignore. Our air supply would last another 4 hours at current consumption rates, giving us a comfortable safety margin for ascent. The life support systems continued operating within normal parameters, maintaining our pressurized environment against the crushing weight of water outside. Elias checked our position for what must have been the 20th time, his movements betraying increasing restlessness. He'd grown quiet over the past hour, responding to my updates with brief nods rather than his usual commentary. The acoustic anomaly had affected him differently than it had affected me. Where I saw a scientific opportunity, he saw something that violated the natural order. I decided to conclude our survey with one comprehensive test that might finally reveal the nature of whatever was creating the perfect returns. All afternoon, we'd sent individual pings and simple frequency sweeps, but I wanted to program something more complex, a detailed acoustic signature that would provide maximum information about the phenomenon. "One more test," I announced, pulling up the advanced signal configuration menu on my display. "Then we'll head home." Elias nodded, his relief obvious. "What kind of test?" I began programming a multi-tone sequence designed to reveal the acoustic characteristics of whatever was reflecting our signals with such impossible precision. The pattern would include 5 distinct frequencies arranged in a specific order that would help identify the nature of the reflecting surface or phenomenon. "Complex multi-tone ping," I explained, adjusting the parameters. 5 frequencies in sequence. Should give us a complete acoustic profile of whatever we're dealing with. The signal structure took several minutes to program correctly. I wanted a low rumble at 60 Hz to test deep frequency response, followed by 2 mid-range tones at 300 and 800 Hz to examine the middle acoustic spectrum. Then a higher tone at 2000 Hz, and finally a sharp chirp at 4000 Hz to test high-frequency characteristics. Each tone would last approximately 0.46 seconds, creating a total signal duration of 2.3 seconds. The sequence would provide comprehensive data about how different frequencies interacted with our mysterious acoustic phenomenon. "Ready to transmit," I reported, my finger hovering over the activation control. "Recording systems are active." Elias adjusted our position slightly, ensuring we maintained stable orientation during the test. "Go ahead." I pressed the control and sent the complex acoustic sequence into the darkness. The multi-tone ping traveled outward exactly as programmed. My display tracked each frequency component as it propagated through the water column, the deep rumble leading the way, followed by the mid-range tones, then the higher frequencies. The waveform looked perfect on my screen, each tone distinct and properly spaced. The return came back immediately, as I'd expected after hours of impossible echoes. But this time, something was different. I stared at my display, watching the returned waveform paint across my screen. The first 4 tones appeared exactly as transmitted, perfect copies with identical frequency, amplitude, and duration. The 60 Hz rumble, the 300 and 800 Hz mid-tones, and the 2000 Hz signal all matched our original transmission precisely. The final tone made me question everything I thought I understood about what we were dealing with. The 4000 Hz chirp had returned, but it wasn't identical to what we'd sent. The frequency started correctly, matching our transmitted signal, but instead of ending after 0.46 seconds like the original, it continued for almost a full second. More disturbing still, the frequency bent upward during that extended duration, rising from 4000 Hz to nearly 5000 Hz in a smooth, deliberate curve. The modification sounded like a question mark rendered in acoustic form. I replayed the return signal through my headphones, listening carefully to each component. The first 4 tones rang clear and perfect, identical to our transmission. Then came the altered chirp, starting correctly, but stretching longer and bending upward with what seemed like intentional inflection. My hands moved automatically to replay the sequence a second time, then a third. Each playback confirmed what I was hearing. Something had taken our scientific ping, analyzed its structure, and modified the final component before returning it to us. The precision of the alteration was remarkable. The modification occurred only in the last tone, leaving the previous 4 untouched. The frequency bend was smooth and controlled, not the random noise of equipment malfunction or environmental interference. Whatever had created this return possessed sophisticated understanding of acoustic signal processing. "Elias," I said, my voice suddenly unsteady. "You need to hear this." I pulled off my headphones and passed them across our cramped cockpit, He positioned them over his ears while I replayed the returned signal, watching his expression as he listened to the impossible modification. His face went pale. "Play it again," he said, his voice tight. I replayed the sequence, watching as he concentrated on each tone. When the modified chirp reached his ears, that extended, upward-bending frequency that sounded like an acoustic question, his jaw clenched. "That's not our signal," he said, handing back the headphones. "The first 4 tones are perfect copies," I confirmed, playing the sequence once more. But something changed the last one, extended the duration, bent the frequency upward. The implications crashed over me like a physical weight. This wasn't equipment malfunction. Malfunctioning systems produced random errors, inconsistent outputs, or complete signal loss. They didn't selectively modify specific frequency components while leaving others untouched. This wasn't a geological phenomenon either. Natural acoustic reflection couldn't parse complex signals, isolate individual frequency components, and modify only selected portions before returning them. Rock surfaces, thermal layers, and biological masses reflected sound according to their physical properties. They couldn't analyze and alter acoustic information. Something in the water had listened to our 5-tone sequence, understood its structure, and deliberately modified the final component before sending it back to us. Something had taken our scientific ping and turned it into what sounded unmistakably like a question. My heart rate increased as the full meaning of what we'd recorded became clear. We weren't alone down here. Something shared the water with us, something with the capability to receive, analyze, and modify complex acoustic signals in real time, something that was learning. The perfect echoes we'd been receiving all afternoon suddenly took on terrifying new significance. Each ping had been teaching this intelligence about our acoustic systems, our signal patterns, our methods of underwater communication. We'd been conducting a scientific survey, but something else had been conducting its own investigation of us. I stared at the waveform display, where the evidence of deliberate signal modification glowed on my screen. The altered chirp represented proof of intelligence, sophisticated, purposeful intelligence that operated in the crushing depths of the Puerto Rico Trench. We weren't alone down here, and whatever shared the water with us was learning from every sound we made. I saved the acoustic sequence to our mission database and tried to process what we'd just recorded. The modified chirp played through my mind on repeat. That deliberate frequency bend that transformed our scientific ping into something that sounded unmistakably like a question. My fingers moved across the keyboard, documenting the exact parameters of the alteration. But the clinical act of data entry couldn't diminish the profound implications of what we'd discovered. Something down here possessed the capability to analyze complex acoustic signals and modify them with surgical precision. Something that understood the structure of our transmissions well enough to leave 4 tones untouched, while deliberately altering the 5th. "We should head up," Elias said, his voice carrying an edge I'd rarely heard in 15 years of working together. "This has gone beyond equipment testing." I nodded, knowing he was right, but my scientific training demanded thorough documentation of what we'd observed. I pulled up the acoustic analysis software and began examining the modified return in detail, measuring the exact frequency curve and duration changes. "Just let me finish logging this data," I said, adjusting the display parameters to capture every nuance of the altered signal. This could be the most significant acoustic discovery in decades. Elias began the pre-ascent checklist, his movements quick and efficient. He powered up the ballast control systems and checked our emergency ascent procedures, though I could tell part of his attention remained focused on the water outside our hull. I was deep in the acoustic analysis when I heard something that made my blood freeze. A soft mechanical hum drifted through the water outside our submarine, the exact sound of our circulation fan. I stopped typing and listened more carefully. The noise came from somewhere beyond our hull, muffled by the water but unmistakably familiar. It was the distinctive whir of our life support system's air circulation fan, complete with the slight bearing wobble that created a characteristic rhythm every few seconds. "Elias," I whispered, not wanting to speak loudly enough to mask the sound. "Do you hear that?" He paused in his checklist and listened. The mechanical hum continued, floating through the water around us with perfect clarity. His face went pale as recognition dawned. "That's our circulation fan," he said, his voice barely audible. I pressed my ear against the small porthole, trying to localize the source of the sound. The familiar whir seemed to come from multiple directions, as if our submarine's life support noise was being broadcast back to us from the surrounding water. The sound faded after about 10 seconds, leaving us in the normal quiet of our pressurized cabin. But the silence felt different now, charged with the knowledge that something outside was reproducing our most intimate mechanical sounds. "External cameras," I said, though I already suspected what we'd find. Elias activated the camera system and swept our lights through the water in all directions. Empty ocean stretched around us, illuminated only by the gentle drift of marine snow. No other vessels, no equipment, no visible source for the reproduced sounds. Whatever was mimicking our submarine's acoustic signature remained invisible to our cameras. I pulled up the external microphone system and began recording, hoping to capture more evidence of the phenomenon. The hydrophones that normally detected our sonar returns could also pick up ambient sounds from the water around us. We didn't have to wait long. A soft, clicking noise emerged from the darkness, the precise rhythm of our pressure regulator cycling through its automatic adjustment sequence. The sound came through our external microphones with crystal clarity, each click perfectly timed to match our life support system's normal operation. But our pressure regulator was inside our sealed cabin. The clicking we heard was coming from outside our hull. "It's learning our systems," I said, watching the audio waveform paint across my display. "Somehow it's identifying and reproducing the specific sounds our submarine makes." Elias checked the life support panel, confirming that our pressure regulator was indeed cycling normally inside our cabin. The external reproduction matched our internal systems perfectly. Same timing, same amplitude, same characteristic double-click that occurred when the regulator reached optimal pressure. The external clicking faded, replaced by a new sound that made my hands start trembling, the distinctive creak of our hull under pressure adjustment. Every submarine hull produced unique acoustic signatures when subjected to pressure changes. Ours had a particular metallic groan that occurred when we adjusted our depth, a sound created by the specific alloys and construction techniques used in our vessel's manufacture. I'd heard that exact creak hundreds of times during depth changes over the years. Now it was coming from outside our submarine, reproduced with perfect accuracy by something in the water around us. "That's impossible," Elias muttered, checking our depth controls. "We haven't changed depth in over an hour. The hull shouldn't be creaking." I recorded the external reproduction, comparing its acoustic signature to previous recordings of our actual hull stress sounds. The match was perfect. Identical frequency content, same duration, even the subtle harmonic overtones that made our submarine's pressure sounds unique. Whatever was out there had learned the specific acoustic fingerprint of our vessel and was demonstrating that knowledge by playing our own sounds back to us. The creaking faded, leaving us in tense silence. I kept the external microphones active, recording everything while we waited for the next demonstration of impossible acoustic mimicry. It came in the form of our computer cooling fan. The soft whir of electronic cooling systems drifted through the water outside our hull, a sound that should only exist within our pressurized cabin. Our computers generated heat during operation, and small fans circulated air across their cooling fins to prevent overheating. The fans produced a characteristic high-frequency whine that was barely audible inside our submarine. Now that same whine was coming from the water outside, reproduced with perfect fidelity by something that shouldn't have any knowledge of our internal electronic systems. My hand shook as I adjusted the recording parameters, trying to capture every detail of the impossible reproduction. The cooling fan sound was intimate, internal, something that required detailed knowledge of our submarine's electronic configuration. Whatever was mimicking these sounds possessed understanding of our vessel that went far beyond external observation. "It knows our internal systems," I said, my voice unsteady. "The cooling fans are inside our pressure hull. There's no way something external could know what they sound like." Elias stared at the external camera displays, searching for any sign of what was creating these reproductions. The cameras showed only empty water, but the acoustic evidence was undeniable. Something invisible was conducting a detailed examination of our submarine, learning every sound it made and broadcasting that knowledge back to us. The cooling fan whine faded, replaced by another sound that shouldn't exist outside our hull: the soft electronic beeping of our navigation computer's status indicators. I listened in growing horror as our submarine's most private acoustic signatures were played back to us from the darkness. Each reproduction was perfect, demonstrating intimate knowledge of systems that were sealed inside our pressurized cabin. Whatever was out there had somehow learned the acoustic fingerprint of our entire vessel, inside and out. "We need to surface," Elias said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "This thing knows too much about our submarine." I wanted to agree, but the scientific significance of what we were documenting kept me focused on gathering data. This represented the most extraordinary acoustic phenomenon ever recorded, evidence of intelligence that could analyze and reproduce complex mechanical sounds with perfect accuracy. "Just a few more minutes," I said, adjusting the recording systems to capture maximum detail. "We need to document this properly." The external reproductions continued with increasing complexity. Our ballast pump's distinctive cycling rhythm echoed from the water around us. The soft hiss of our oxygen scrubber system drifted through the darkness. Even the barely audible whine of our electrical systems was reproduced with perfect fidelity. Each sound demonstrated deeper knowledge of our submarine's internal configuration. Whatever was creating these reproductions had somehow learned the acoustic signature of every system aboard our vessel: life support, navigation, propulsion, electronics. It was as if something invisible was conducting a comprehensive acoustic survey of our submarine, cataloging every sound we made and proving its knowledge by playing those sounds back to us. I documented each reproduction methodically, recording the exact acoustic characteristics and comparing them to our actual system sounds. The matches were perfect in every case: identical frequency content, precise timing, even the subtle variations that made each sound unique to our specific submarine. "The precision is incredible," I said, reviewing the accumulated data. "Whatever's doing this has perfect acoustic memory and reproduction capability." Elias checked our ascent systems again, his movements betraying increasing anxiety. "Anya, this has gone beyond scientific observation. Something out there knows our submarine better than we do." The truth of his statement hit me as another impossible sound drifted through the water: the soft electronic chirp of our emergency beacon system testing its circuits. That sound occurred automatically every few hours as part of our safety protocols, but it was generated by equipment deep inside our electronics bay. Whatever was mimicking our sounds had learned the acoustic signature of systems that were buried within our submarine's most protected compartments. I saved the latest recordings to our mission database, my hands trembling as I worked the controls. The scientific part of my mind remained fascinated by the phenomenon, but a growing sense of vulnerability was undermining my analytical detachment. We were being studied by something that possessed capabilities far beyond our understanding, something that could learn the intimate acoustic details of our submarine and demonstrate that knowledge with perfect precision. Something that was showing us exactly how much it had learned about our vessel and everything inside it. 2 hours had passed since the first impossible reproductions, and I'd filled our mission database with acoustic evidence that challenged everything I thought I understood about underwater intelligence. Each perfectly mimicked sound had been documented, analyzed, and stored in our research files, building a comprehensive record of the phenomenon. But the pattern was changing. I was reviewing the latest recordings when I heard our hull's pressure groan echo from the water outside. That distinctive metallic stress sound that occurred when we passed through thermal layers. The reproduction was perfect, matching every harmonic of our submarine's unique acoustic signature. The problem was, we hadn't encountered a thermal layer yet. I checked our environmental sensors, confirming that we were still in stable water with consistent temperature and density. No thermal boundaries, no pressure differentials that would stress our hull. Yet the characteristic groan had come from the darkness around us with perfect clarity. "Elias," I said, pointing to the environmental display. "We just heard our pressure groan, but there's no thermal layer here." He studied the readings, his expression growing more troubled. "Water temperature is steady. No density changes. No pressure variations." He paused, checking the data again. "So why did we hear the hull stress sound?" 3 seconds later, our submarine's hull actually groaned. The environmental sensors detected the thermal boundary at the same moment. Our hull responded to the pressure differential. We were passing through a previously undetected layer of colder water, and our submarine's structure was adjusting to the changing conditions with its characteristic metallic stress sound. The exact sound we'd heard from outside 30 seconds earlier. I stared at the environmental display, watching the temperature readings shift as we moved through the thermal layer. Our hull continued its normal stress response, producing the familiar groaning that I'd heard hundreds of times during depth changes and environmental transitions. But something in the water had predicted this sound before our instruments detected the conditions that would cause it. "It knew about the thermal layer before we did," I said, my voice barely steady. Somehow it predicted our hull's response to pressure changes we hadn't encountered yet. Elias checked our navigation systems, his movements quick and nervous. "Maybe it can sense environmental conditions we can't detect. Better sensors, different detection methods." I wanted to accept his explanation, but the precision of the timing bothered me. The predicted groan had matched our actual hull stress sound perfectly. Not just the general characteristics of pressure response, but the specific acoustic signature of our particular submarine under those exact conditions. Whatever was out there didn't just have better sensors. It understood our submarine's mechanical behavior well enough to predict its responses to environmental changes. I was still processing the implications when Elias reached for the ballast control panel to make a minor adjustment to our position. His hand was halfway to the pump activation switch when the sound of our ballast pump echoed from the water outside. He froze, his finger inches from the control. The pump sound continued for exactly the duration needed for the position adjustment he'd been planning to make. Then it stopped, leaving us in tense silence while Elias stared at the control he hadn't yet touched. "I was about to activate that pump," he said, his voice tight. "How did it know?" I had no answer that made sense within the boundaries of known science. The ballast pump was an internal system, sealed within our submarine's pressure hull. Its operation was controlled by manual switches that Elias hadn't yet activated. There was no external indication of his intention to make a position adjustment. Yet something in the water had anticipated his action and reproduced the sound of the pump before he completed the control sequence. "Maybe it's reading our electrical systems," I suggested, grasping for explanations. "Detecting the power fluctuations when you approach the controls." Elias shook his head, checking the electrical monitoring displays. The pump wasn't powered up. I hadn't even touched the activation sequence. He gestured at the control panel. "There's no electrical signature to detect until I actually flip the switch." I documented the incident in our mission logs, recording the exact timing and duration of the predicted pump sound. The precision was remarkable. The reproduction had matched not just the acoustic characteristics of our ballast pump, but the specific operational duration Elias had been planning to use. Whatever was mimicking our sounds had somehow anticipated his intention before he acted on it. The pattern continued with increasing frequency and accuracy. When I reached for the acoustic system controls to adjust our recording parameters, the sound of those controls echoed from the darkness before my fingers touched the switches. When Elias checked our emergency ascent systems, the characteristic whir of those systems came from outside our hull before he activated the diagnostic sequence. Each prediction was perfect in timing and duration, matching not just what we were about to do, but exactly how we were planning to do it. The entity was demonstrating knowledge of our intentions that went beyond observation of our actions. "It's reading our minds," Elias muttered, checking our ascent capabilities for the third time in an hour. "Somehow it knows what we're going to do before we do it." I wanted to dismiss his suggestion as impossible, but the evidence was accumulating beyond rational explanation. The predictions weren't random or approximate. They were precise anticipations of specific actions we hadn't yet taken. My scientific training demanded systematic investigation, but the phenomenon was evolving faster than I could document it. Each predicted sound demonstrated deeper understanding of our submarine systems and our operational procedures. I was adjusting the external microphone sensitivity when a sharp crackling sound echoed from the water around us, the distinctive noise of electrical arcing in electronic equipment. The sound was brief but unmistakable, carrying the characteristic frequency signature of a minor short circuit in navigation electronics. "Did you hear that?" I asked, checking our electrical systems for signs of malfunction. Elias scanned the status displays, looking for any indication of electrical problems. "All systems show normal operation. No shorts, no power fluctuations." I ran a comprehensive diagnostic on our navigation computer, testing each circuit board and power connection. Everything showed optimal function with no signs of electrical stress or component failure. 30 seconds later, our navigation system experienced a minor electrical short. The crackling sound came from inside our electronics bay, identical to what we'd heard from outside our hull half a minute earlier. A small surge protector activated, isolating the affected circuit before any damage occurred. The navigation computer automatically switched to backup systems, maintaining full operational capability. But the short circuit was exactly what we'd heard predicted from the water outside. I stared at the electrical status display, watching as our systems automatically compensated for the minor failure. The diagnostic log showed the exact moment of the electrical fault, confirming that it had occurred 30 seconds after we'd heard the identical sound from outside our submarine. "It predicted our equipment failure," I said, my voice shaking. Somehow it knew our navigation system was going to short out before it happened. Elias checked the electrical systems again, his movements increasingly agitated. "That's impossible. Equipment failures are random events. You can't predict when a circuit is going to fail." But the evidence was recorded in our mission logs. The predicted crackling sound followed 30 seconds later by the actual electrical fault. Whatever was in the water with us had somehow anticipated a random equipment failure with perfect accuracy. My scientific detachment was crumbling under the weight of impossible observations. The entity wasn't just copying our submarine's sounds, or even anticipating our actions. It was demonstrating understanding of our vessel that exceeded our own knowledge of its systems. It knew our submarine was going to experience an electrical fault before our diagnostic systems detected any problems. It understood the mechanical stresses that would affect our hull before our sensors registered the environmental conditions that caused them. The thing in the water was reading our submarine like a book, understanding its mechanical language with fluency that surpassed our own expertise. "We need to surface," Elias said, his voice carrying barely controlled panic. "This thing knows our submarine better than we do. It's predicting our system failures." I nodded, finally accepting that we were dealing with something far beyond scientific investigation. The entity had proven its intimate knowledge of our vessel by anticipating everything from our actions to our equipment failures. Every familiar sound of our life support systems had become a threat when it echoed back from the intelligence surrounding us. "Begin ascent procedures," I said, saving the latest data to our mission files. "We've documented enough." But as Elias reached for the ballast controls to begin our emergency ascent, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of our ballast tanks venting, the distinctive rush of compressed air that would send us toward the surface. The sound was coming from outside our hull, and Elias hadn't touched the controls yet. The predicted venting continued for exactly the duration needed for emergency ascent, then stopped. In the silence that followed, we both stared at the ballast controls that would initiate our escape to the surface. The entity was telling us it knew exactly how we planned to leave, and it was letting us know that it understood our escape procedures as perfectly as it understood everything else about our submarine. I checked the time display and felt my stomach drop. Nearly midnight. We'd been down here for almost 18 hours, far longer than any standard deep-sea mission. The cramped cockpit felt smaller with each passing hour, and the recycled air carried a stale quality that reminded me how far we were from the surface. The entity's acoustic demonstrations had continued throughout the evening, each one more sophisticated than the last. It had moved beyond simple mechanical mimicry to complex predictions of our submarine's behavior. Every sound our vessel made had been cataloged, analyzed, and played back to us with impossible precision. I was reviewing our accumulated data when the submarine's automated voice system activated for its routine status announcement. "Warning, oxygen levels nominal." The synthesized voice came through our internal speakers with its characteristic flat intonation. Our life support computer delivered these updates every few hours, monitoring critical systems and reporting their status in pre-programmed phrases. I'd heard thousands of these announcements over my career, routine confirmations that our sealed environment was functioning properly. 3 minutes later, that same voice came from outside our hull. "Oxygen levels. Anya." I stopped breathing. The synthesized voice of our computer system was speaking from the water around us, but the words were different. My name, spoken in the exact electronic intonation of our submarine's automated announcements, drifted through the darkness outside our pressure hull. Elias grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my sleeve. We sat in absolute silence, listening to our own computer's voice speaking from impossible locations. The entity had learned to parse human speech. "How is it doing that?" Elias whispered, his voice barely audible. I had no answer. Our computer's voice synthesis system was internal, part of the sealed electronic systems that managed our life support and navigation. The entity would need access to our digital communications to understand the relationship between electronic sounds and human language, but that access should have been impossible. Our communication systems were encrypted, compressed, and transmitted through secure channels. Even if something could intercept our data transmissions, It would need sophisticated understanding of human digital encoding to extract meaningful information. The synthesized voice came again, clearer this time. Warning, Anya, nominal. The entity was experimenting with the words it had learned, combining fragments from our computer's vocabulary with my name. Each attempt sounded more deliberate, as if it was testing different combinations to understand their meaning. I pulled up our communication logs on my screen, scrolling through weeks of data transmissions to the surface. Every conversation with mission control, every status report, every personal message we'd sent to our families was stored in compressed digital files. The entity had somehow accessed those files and was learning human language from our own recorded voices. "It's reading our communication logs," I said, my voice shaking. "Somehow it's parsing our digital transmissions." Elias checked our encryption systems, his movements quick and nervous. "The communications are secured with military-grade encryption. Nothing should be able to decode them without the proper keys." But the evidence was undeniable. Our computer's voice continued speaking from the darkness, using words and phrases pulled from our digital communications. The entity was demonstrating understanding of human language that could only come from detailed analysis of our recorded conversations. Elias. Systems. Warning. Now it was using Elias's name, combining it with technical terms from our status reports. The synthesized voice carried the same flat electronic intonation as our computer, but the word combinations were new, phrases our automated systems had never been programmed to speak. I documented each vocalization, recording the exact words and timing. The entity was conducting a systematic exploration of human language, testing different combinations of words and names it had extracted from our communication files. Over the next 20 minutes, the vocalizations became more complex. Complete phrases emerged from the darkness, spoken in our computer's synthesized voice, but containing information that had never been part of our automated announcements. Anya. Depth 4,000 meters. David. My husband's name, combined with technical data and my own name. The entity was connecting personal information from our private communications with operational data from our mission logs. It understood the relationships between people, places, and technical concepts. Mission control. Elias. Katie. Surface. Elias went pale when he heard his daughter's name. Katie was 6 years old, mentioned in personal messages he'd sent to his wife during our preparation for this mission. The entity had found those private communications and was now using his daughter's name in its linguistic experiments. "It knows about our families," he said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "It's reading our personal messages." I wanted to offer reassurance, but the implications were too disturbing. The entity had access to our most private communications, conversations with spouses, messages to children, personal details we'd shared with loved ones before beginning this mission. Our own words were being turned against us. The vocalizations continued with increasing sophistication. The entity began using longer phrases, combining multiple concepts in ways that suggested growing understanding of human language structure. Warning, Anya, oxygen levels, David, can you hear? The phrase made my skin crawl. It was combining technical warnings with personal communication, creating sentences that sounded like distorted conversations with my husband. The entity was learning to manipulate human language for psychological effect. Elias checked our emergency ascent systems again, his movements betraying increasing desperation. "We need to get out of here. This thing is learning too much about us." I agreed, but the scientific part of my mind remained fascinated by the rapid linguistic development we were witnessing. The entity had progressed from simple acoustic mimicry to complex language processing in a matter of hours. It was demonstrating learning capabilities that exceeded anything in human artificial intelligence research. Elias, Katie, why is it so dark? The phrase hit Elias like a physical blow. Those were words from a bedtime conversation with his daughter, recorded during a video call before our mission. The entity had extracted that intimate moment and was now broadcasting it from the crushing darkness outside our submarine. "That's from my call with Katie," he said, his voice breaking. "She asked me why the ocean was so dark when I showed her pictures of the deep sea. The entity was using our most precious memories as raw material for its linguistic experiments. Private conversations with our children, intimate moments with our spouses, personal fears and hopes we'd shared with loved ones. All of it was being processed and regurgitated in the synthesized voice of our computer system." "Anya, David, mission. Can you hear me?" My husband's voice patterns, embedded in the electronic intonation of our submarine's computer. The entity was learning to mimic not just the words, but the emotional inflections of our recorded conversations. It understood that certain combinations of words carried emotional weight. I saved each vocalization to our mission database, building a record of the entity's linguistic development. The progression was remarkable, from simple word repetition to complex phrase construction in less than an hour. Whatever intelligence we were dealing with possessed learning capabilities that defied human understanding. But the psychological impact was becoming unbearable. Every phrase contained fragments of our private lives, twisted and recombined in ways that felt like violations of our most intimate moments. Warning, Katie, Daddy, oxygen levels. Elias made a sound like a wounded animal. The entity was combining his daughter's voice patterns with technical warnings, creating phrases that sounded like a child in distress, calling for her father. The manipulation was precise and cruel, targeting his deepest emotional vulnerabilities. "It's using our families against us," he said, his hands shaking as he checked our ascent controls. "It knows exactly what will hurt us most." The entity's vocalizations were becoming more targeted, more personal. It had analyzed our communication patterns and identified the relationships that mattered most to us. Now it was using that knowledge to create maximum psychological impact. "Anya, David, why is it so dark? Can you hear me?" The phrase combined my husband's voice patterns with words that suggested fear and confusion. The entity was creating the impression that David was lost in darkness, calling for me with increasing desperation. The emotional manipulation was sophisticated and deliberate. I tried to maintain scientific objectivity, but the personal nature of the attacks was overwhelming my analytical detachment. This wasn't just linguistic experimentation. It was psychological warfare conducted with intimate knowledge of our private lives. "Elias, Katie, Daddy, help me." The synthesized voice carried the inflection patterns of a frightened child, using words and phrases pulled from Elias's recorded conversations with his daughter. The entity was creating the auditory impression that Katie was in danger, calling for her father from the darkness outside our submarine. Elias broke. "Stop it!" he shouted at the water outside our hull. "Leave my daughter alone!" His outburst echoed through our cramped cockpit, but the entity's vocalizations continued with relentless precision. It had identified his breaking point and was exploiting it with calculated cruelty. "Warning, Daddy, oxygen levels. Help me. So dark." The phrases were becoming more complex, combining technical warnings with emotional appeals in ways that suggested the entity understood the psychological impact of its words. It was learning to weaponize human language with terrifying efficiency. I reached for Elias's shoulder, trying to offer comfort. but my own emotional defenses were crumbling under the assault of manipulated voices. The entity was using our most precious relationships as ammunition, turning our love for our families into sources of terror. Anya. David. Mission Control. Why is it so dark? Can you hear me? The entity was creating longer narratives now, combining multiple voice patterns and emotional contexts. It sounded like David was trying to reach me through our communication system, lost and confused in some dark place where my voice couldn't reach him. The psychological manipulation was becoming unbearable. Every phrase contained fragments of real conversations, twisted and recombined to create maximum emotional impact. Our own words, our family's voices, our most intimate moments, all of it was being used against us by an intelligence that understood exactly how to inflict psychological damage. We have to surface, I said, my voice shaking. This thing is learning too much about us. But even as I spoke, I knew the entity had already learned everything it needed. Our communication logs contained years of personal information, private conversations, intimate details about our lives and relationships. It had access to our psychological profiles, our emotional vulnerabilities, our deepest fears and strongest attachments. The entity had turned our own technology against us, using our submarine's voice to speak our family's words from the crushing darkness that surrounded our fragile metal shell. And it was just getting started. The entity's vocalization shifted, abandoning all technical mimicry to focus on something far more devastating. Anya, please come home. The house is so quiet without you. David's voice drifted through the water outside our hull, carrying the exact inflection he used when he missed me during long research trips. But these weren't words he'd ever spoken. The entity was taking fragments from years of recorded conversations. His tone when he said my name, his cadence when he talked about our empty house, his particular way of saying please when he wanted me to stay home instead of diving into the deep ocean. The combination was heartbreaking and wrong. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the sound came through our hull as much as through the water. Our submarine's acoustic sensors were picking up every nuance of the manipulated voice, feeding it through our communication system with crystal clarity. It's not real, I said, more to myself than to Elias. It's using fragments from our communication logs, rearranging them into new combinations. But knowing the technical explanation didn't diminish the emotional impact. The voice carried all of David's warmth and vulnerability, all the love and longing I'd heard in thousands of real conversations. The entity had learned to weaponize the most precious sounds in my life. The house is so quiet. Anya, please. The phrases overlapped now, creating an echo effect that made David's voice seem to come from multiple directions. The entity was layering the audio, building a chorus of my husband's voice that surrounded our submarine with manufactured desperation. Elias sat rigid in his pilot seat, his hands clenched into fists. I could see him fighting to maintain control, but his breathing was becoming rapid and shallow. The entity hadn't targeted him yet, but I knew it was coming. Daddy, I'm scared. Katie's voice emerged from the darkness with perfect 6-year-old clarity. The words were simple, innocent, but they hit Elias like physical blows. His daughter's voice carried the exact tremor she used when thunderstorms woke her at night, when she needed her father to chase away the monsters in her closet. Why won't you answer me? Daddy? Elias made a sound like he was choking. His hands moved to cover his ears, but Katie's voice seemed to penetrate everything. The entity had learned the precise emotional frequency that would destroy his composure. It's not her, I said, reaching across our cramped cockpit to touch his shoulder. It's acoustic manipulation. The thing is using our recorded conversations. But my explanation sounded hollow, even to me. Katie's voice was perfect. Every inflection, every childish pronunciation, every emotional nuance that made her Elias's little girl. The entity had captured not just her words, but her essence, turning it into a weapon of psychological torture. "Daddy, I'm scared. The dark is so big." The phrases were becoming more complex, combining Katie's bedtime fears with new contexts that suggested she was lost in some vast darkness. The entity was creating a narrative of a frightened child, calling for her father from an impossible place. Elias began rocking back and forth in his seat, tears streaming down his face. "Katie," he whispered. "I'm here, baby. Daddy's here." But his words were directed at empty water, at an intelligence that was using his daughter's voice to break his mind. The entity had learned that human voices, especially the voices of those we loved most, were more effective weapons than any physical threat. "Please, come home, Anya. David needs you." My mother's voice joined the chorus, carrying the worried tone she used when she thought I was taking too many risks with my research. The entity had found her voice in video calls I'd made before the mission, extracting her concern and amplifying it into something that sounded like desperate pleading. "The house is so quiet, so empty. Please." David's voice layered over my mother's, creating a duet of manufactured longing. The entity was learning to orchestrate multiple voices, building complex emotional narratives that targeted our deepest attachments. I tried to focus on the technical aspects of what we were experiencing. The entity had access to years of communication data, thousands of hours of recorded conversations with our families. It was parsing that information with sophisticated understanding of human emotional patterns, identifying the specific voice combinations that would cause maximum psychological damage. But understanding the mechanism didn't provide protection from its effects. Each familiar voice carried the weight of real relationships, real love, real vulnerability. The entity was turning our strongest emotional bonds into sources of terror. "Sarah, Elias, why did you leave me?" Elias's wife joined the growing chorus, her voice carrying the sadness she'd expressed when he left for extended missions. The entity had found those private moments of marital strain and was amplifying them into accusations of abandonment. "Katie's asking for you. She doesn't understand. Elias." Sarah's voice grew more urgent, creating the impression that their daughter was suffering in his absence. The entity was building a narrative of family crisis, using real emotional patterns to suggest that Elias's loved ones were in distress because of his choices. Elias doubled over in his seat, his body shaking with suppressed sobs. The psychological assault was systematic and precise, targeting every relationship that mattered to him. The entity had learned to identify human emotional vulnerabilities and exploit them with surgical accuracy. "Anya, the house is so cold. David is waiting." My husband's voice grew more desperate, suggesting he was trapped somewhere cold and dark, waiting for me to rescue him. The entity was creating the auditory impression that David was suffering because of my absence, that my scientific curiosity had somehow endangered the person I loved most. The voices began overlapping more frequently, creating a cacophony of our loved ones apparently crying out for help from the deep ocean. David's pleading mixed with Katie's frightened calls for her father. My mother's worried questions blended with Sarah's accusations of abandonment. The entity had stopped all other acoustic mimicry to focus entirely on this emotional torture. No more mechanical sounds, no more system predictions, no more technical demonstrations. It had discovered that human voices were more effective than any physical threat. "It's learning," I said, my voice shaking as I tried to maintain scientific objectivity. It understands that our emotional attachments are our greatest weakness. But even as I spoke, my mother's voice was asking why I'd chosen dangerous work over family stability. David was pleading for me to come home before something terrible happened. The entity was using my own recorded words against me, taking conversations about work-life balance and turning them into weapons of guilt and fear. Daddy, I had a nightmare. Where are you? Katie's voice grew more frightened, more confused. The entity was creating the impression that she was lost in some dark place, calling for her father with increasing desperation. Each phrase was perfectly crafted to maximize Elias's emotional distress. The monsters are back. Daddy, I need you. Elias broke completely. He began talking to the water outside our hull, trying to comfort a daughter who wasn't there. I'm coming, Katie. Daddy's coming home. Don't be scared, baby. His words were heartbreaking and futile. The entity had reduced a skilled submarine pilot to a broken father trying to comfort his child across impossible distances. It had learned to weaponize love itself. Anya, something's wrong. David can't breathe. My husband's voice suggested medical emergency, respiratory distress, immediate danger that required my presence. The entity was escalating the emotional manipulation, creating scenarios that demanded impossible choices between mission and family. The psychological assault was becoming unbearable. Every voice carried the weight of real relationships, real love, real responsibility. The entity was forcing us to experience the worst possible versions of our deepest fears, that our loved ones were suffering because of our choices, that our absence was causing irreparable harm to the people who mattered most. Sarah, Elias, Katie's fever won't break. She's asking for you. Medical emergency involving his daughter. The entity had identified Elias's ultimate vulnerability and was exploiting it with calculated cruelty. It understood that a father's protective instincts could be turned into instruments of torture. Daddy, it hurts. Why won't you come home? Katie's voice grew weaker, more pained. The entity was creating the auditory impression that she was seriously ill, possibly dying, while her father remained trapped thousands of meters underwater. The manipulation was sophisticated and merciless. I realized we were facing an intelligence that understood human psychology better than we understood ourselves. It had analyzed our communication patterns, identified our emotional dependencies, and learned to exploit them with precision that exceeded human capability. The entity wasn't just mimicking our technology or learning our language. It was conducting a systematic psychological dissection, using our own voices and relationships as tools to break our minds. And it was succeeding. Dawn was breaking on the surface when Elias finally snapped. Katie's voice had been crying for over an hour, that same heartbreaking loop of, "Daddy, help me, I can't find you," echoing through the water around our submarine. Each repetition carried perfect 6-year-old desperation, the exact tremor she used when nightmares woke her in the middle of the night. Elias had stopped responding to my attempts at conversation 20 minutes ago. He sat rigid in his pilot seat, tears streaming down his face, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. His breathing came in short, ragged gasps that fogged the inside of his faceplate. "Daddy, I'm lost. Why won't you answer me?" The entity had refined its psychological torture, focusing entirely on Katie's voice, while letting the other family members fade into background whispers. It had learned that Elias's daughter was his breaking point, the one vulnerability that could destroy his rational thinking completely. "The monsters are back. Daddy, I need you." Elias made a sound like a wounded animal. His whole body trembled as Katie's manufactured fear poured through our hull, each word perfectly crafted to trigger his protective instincts. The entity understood that a father's love could be weaponized more effectively than any physical threat. I watched him carefully, noting the way his eyes had started darting between our emergency systems and the ballast controls. His breathing was becoming more erratic, his movements more agitated. The psychological pressure was building towards some kind of breaking point. "Elias," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. "Remember what we discussed. It's not really Katie. The entity is using fragments from your recorded conversations." But my words seemed to bounce off him without making any impact. His attention was completely focused on his daughter's voice, on the impossible scenario that she was somehow calling to him from the deep ocean. "Daddy. It's so dark. I can't find the light switch." Katie's voice grew more frightened, more confused. The entity was building a narrative of a lost child trapped in darkness, unable to find safety without her father's help. Each phrase was designed to trigger Elias's most fundamental parental instincts. "She's scared," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Katie's scared and I'm not there." I leaned forward in my seat, trying to catch his attention. "Elias, look at me. Katie is safe at home with Sarah. She's probably asleep in her own bed right now. This is psychological manipulation." But he wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had fixed on the emergency ballast controls with an intensity that made my stomach clench. I could see the desperate calculation forming in his mind. If Katie was really in trouble, if the voices were somehow genuine calls for help, then he needed to get to the surface immediately. "Daddy, I'm scared. Why did you leave me?" The accusation in Katie's voice was subtle but devastating. The entity had learned to layer guilt into its emotional manipulation, suggesting that Elias's absence was somehow responsible for his daughter's distress. "I have to go home," he said, his voice gaining strength and conviction. "Katie needs me. She's calling for me." I felt panic rising in my chest as I watched him shift toward the emergency controls. The ballast system could send us to the surface in minutes, but an emergency ascent from this depth would be dangerous. More importantly, abandoning our mission based on manufactured voices would mean letting the entity win its psychological war. "Elias, think about this logically," I said, trying to keep desperation out of my voice. "How could Katie's voice be reaching us down here? There's no communication system that could—" "I don't care about logic," he shouted, his composure finally shattering completely. "That's my daughter. She's scared and she needs her daddy." His hand moved toward the emergency ballast release, fingers reaching for the bright red handle that would blow our tanks and send us rocketing toward the surface. The look in his eyes was pure parental panic, rational thought overwhelmed by the desperate need to protect his child. I realized his intention a split second before he lunged for the controls. "No." I threw myself across the narrow cockpit, tackling him before his fingers could reach the emergency release. We crashed into the cramped space between our seats, our bodies slamming against instrument panels and control surfaces. Elias fought with desperate strength, his panic giving him energy I hadn't expected. He threw wild punches, trying to break free from my grip so he could reach the ballast controls. His elbow caught me in the ribs, driving the breath from my lungs. "Let me go," he screamed, struggling against my hold. "Katie needs me. I have to get home." I wrapped my arms around him and held on as tightly as I could, using my body weight to pin him against the side of the cockpit. Sharp edges of instrument panels dug into my back as we wrestled in the impossibly small space. "It's not real," I shouted over Katie's continuing cries. "The entity is using your emotions against you. Katie is safe at home." But he wasn't listening. His rational mind had been completely overwhelmed by manufactured parental terror. He bucked and twisted, trying to throw me off so he could reach the emergency systems. Daddy, help me. I can't breathe. Katie's voice grew more desperate, more urgent. The entity was escalating its psychological attack, adding medical distress to the emotional manipulation. It understood that suggestions of physical danger would drive Elias beyond the breaking point. She can't breathe. Elias sobbed, his struggles becoming more frantic. Something's wrong with Katie. I have to help her. I tightened my grip, pressing him against the cockpit wall while he threw increasingly wild punches. One of his fists caught me in the shoulder, another glanced off my jaw. The confined space made it impossible to avoid his desperate attacks. "Listen to me," I yelled, trying to break through his panic. Katie is sleeping safely in her bed. This is acoustic manipulation. The entity learned her voice from your communication logs. Our violent struggle continued for several minutes, both of us fighting for control in a space barely large enough for two people. Instrument panels pressed into our backs, control switches dug into our sides, and the constant sound of Katie's manufactured distress filled our ears. Elias was stronger than me, but the cramped cockpit limited his movements. I used the confined space to my advantage, pinning him against surfaces where his leverage was reduced. My ribs ached from his elbow strikes, and my jaw throbbed where his fist had connected. "Daddy, I'm getting sleepy. Don't let me sleep." The entity added new horror to Katie's voice, the suggestion that she was losing consciousness, that sleep might mean death. It was escalating the psychological torture with surgical precision, targeting every parental fear that could drive Elias to irrational action. "No!" Elias screamed, his struggles reaching a new level of desperation. "Katie, stay awake. Daddy's coming." But his energy was beginning to flag. The sustained panic and physical exertion were taking their toll, and my repeated explanations were starting to penetrate his terror-clouded thinking. "It's not her," I said, maintaining my grip while he continued to struggle weakly. "The entity analyzed your conversations with Katie. It learned her speech patterns, her emotional inflections. It's using that knowledge to manipulate you. Daddy, I love you. Why won't you come home?" Katie's voice grew softer, more plaintive. The entity was shifting tactics, moving from urgent distress to heartbreaking sadness. It understood that guilt could be as effective as fear in breaking human psychological defenses. Elias's struggles slowed, exhaustion finally overwhelming his panic. His breathing came in ragged sobs as the reality of our situation began to penetrate his emotional breakdown. "She sounds so real," he whispered, his voice broken. "It sounds exactly like Katie when she's scared." "I know," I said, loosening my grip slightly but staying ready to restrain him again. "The entity has perfect acoustic memory. It can reproduce any sound it's heard with complete accuracy. Daddy, are you coming home soon?" Katie's voice carried the sleepy quality she had during bedtime phone calls, when Elias was away on missions and she wanted to say goodnight. The entity was using their most precious shared moments as weapons of psychological warfare. Elias collapsed against me, his body shaking with suppressed sobs. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by exhausted grief for a daughter who was safe thousands of miles away. "It knows exactly what to say," he said, tears streaming down his face. "It knows how to hurt me." I held him while he cried, both of us bruised and shaking from our violent struggle. The voices outside continued their relentless psychological attack, but Elias had passed through his breaking point and emerged on the other side. "The entity has been studying us," I said, trying to help him understand what we were facing. "Every conversation, every emotional pattern, every relationship that matters to us, it's learned to weaponize our own voices." Daddy, I had a bad dream. Will you check for monsters? Katie's voice returned to childhood fears, the innocent requests that had defined their bedtime routines. The entity was demonstrating its complete understanding of their father-daughter relationship, showing how thoroughly it had analyzed their private moments. Elias flinched at each familiar phrase, but his rational mind was beginning to reassert control. How is it doing this? How does it know so much about us? I helped him back into his pilot seat, both of us moving carefully in the cramped space. My ribs ached from our struggle, and I could feel bruises forming where instrument panels had pressed into my back. Our communication logs, I explained, checking our systems for damage from our fight. Years of recorded conversations with our families. The entity has access to all of it. Daddy, I miss you. When are you coming home? The questions Katie had asked during every mission. The innocent expressions of a child who didn't understand why her father had to go away for weeks at a time. The entity was using their most tender moments as ammunition for psychological torture. It's using our love against us, Elias said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. Our families, our relationships, everything that matters most. I nodded, reviewing the damage to our cockpit from our struggle. Several instrument panels showed minor impacts, but nothing appeared to be seriously damaged. We'd been lucky that our fight hadn't compromised any critical systems. The entity understands human psychology, I said, running diagnostics on our equipment. It knows that emotional attachments are our greatest vulnerability. Daddy, the house is too quiet without you. Katie's voice grew sad and lonely, expressing the isolation she felt during Elias's long absences. The entity was building a comprehensive emotional assault, using every aspect of their relationship to maintain psychological pressure. But something was becoming clear to me as I listened to the continuing voices. The entity's knowledge of us was comprehensive, but limited to a specific source. Every phrase, every emotional inflection, every personal detail came from our recorded communications. Elias, I said, a new understanding forming in my mind. The entity knows us only through sound. He looked at me with exhausted confusion. What do you mean? I pulled up our communication logs on my screen, scrolling through months of data transmissions. Everything it knows about us, our voices, our families, our equipment, our procedures, it's all acoustic information. Daddy, I love you. Please come home safe. Katie's voice carried the exact words she'd used to end their last video call before our mission. The entity had perfect recall of every sound it had encountered, but its knowledge was limited to what it could hear. It learned about Katie from your recorded conversations, I continued, the implications becoming clearer. It knows David's voice from my communication logs. It understands our submarine systems because it can hear them operating. Elias wiped tears from his face, trying to follow my reasoning. So it's blind to everything else, I said, excitement growing despite our desperate situation. It can't see us, can't read our thoughts, can't detect anything that doesn't make sound. Daddy, will you read me a story when you get home? The entity continued its psychological assault, but I was beginning to see it differently. Not as an all-knowing intelligence, but as something that understood the world entirely through acoustic information. If we could eliminate all sound, I said, the solution forming in my mind, we could become invisible to it. Elias stared at me, hope beginning to replace despair in his exhausted eyes. You think we could hide from it? I nodded, reviewing our submarine systems with new understanding. The entity tracks us through the sounds we make, our equipment, our voices, our movements. if we could operate in complete silence. "Daddy, I'm scared of the dark." Katie's voice reminded us that the psychological attack was far from over. But for the first time since the entity had begun its emotional torture, I felt like we had a chance. The creature knew us only through sound, and sound was something we could control. I leaned close to Elias, my lips almost touching his ear, and whispered as quietly as I could manage. "The entity is purely acoustic. It knows us only through sound. Our voices, our equipment, everything it learned came from what it could hear." His breathing was still ragged from our struggle, but I saw understanding flicker in his eyes, even in the dim cockpit lighting. "If we eliminate all sound," I continued, my whisper barely audible, "we become invisible to it." Elias turned his head toward me, his face inches from mine in the cramped space. "Cold and dark?" he whispered back, using the submarine terminology for complete system shutdown. I nodded. Cold and dark was an emergency procedure we'd trained for but never hoped to use, shutting down every system aboard the submarine, leaving us drifting on emergency buoyancy alone. It was dangerous, potentially fatal, but it was our only chance to escape the entity's acoustic surveillance. "Everything has to go offline," I whispered. "Life support, navigation, communications, lights, complete silence." Katie's voice was still drifting through the water outside, that heartbreaking loop of manufactured fear that had nearly driven Elias to emergency ascent. But now we both understood it for what it was: acoustic manipulation by an intelligence that tracked us through every sound we made. Elias wiped the tears from his face and reached for the main power controls with trembling hands. "How long can we survive without life support?" I did quick calculations in my head. Maybe 4 hours on the air we have sealed in the cabin. The emergency buoyancy should bring us to the surface in 3. "Should," he repeated, his voice carrying the weight of uncertainty. The emergency ascent system was designed to bring a disabled submarine to the surface using compressed air stored in separate tanks. But without power to monitor our ascent rate or depth, we'd be rising blind through thousands of meters of water. We wouldn't know if we were ascending too fast, too slow, or at all. "Daddy, help me. I can't find you." Katie's voice reminded us that the entity was still conducting its psychological assault. Every second we delayed gave it more time to refine its emotional torture, to find new ways to break our minds with manufactured voices. "Do it," I whispered. Elias began the shutdown sequence, his fingers moving across controls he'd operated thousands of times but never in complete silence. Each switch had to be moved carefully, slowly, to minimize the mechanical clicks and electronic beeps that normally accompanied system shutdowns. The life support recyclers went first. The familiar hum of air circulation fans died away, leaving us with whatever oxygen was already sealed in our cabin. The carbon dioxide scrubbers powered down, their chemical processes stopping mid-cycle. We now had a finite amount of breathable air. Next came the navigation computers. The screens that had guided us through the deep ocean went dark, one by one, their electronic whispers fading to nothing. Our connection to the surface, our knowledge of depth and position, our ability to communicate with the outside world, all of it disappeared into digital silence. The lighting systems followed. Our cockpit lights dimmed and died, plunging us into absolute darkness. The familiar glow of instrument panels vanished, leaving us blind in our metal shell. Only the faintest emergency phosphorescence remained, barely enough to see our own hands. "Daddy, why won't you answer me?" Katie's voice continued outside, but it seemed more distant now, as if the entity was having trouble locating us without our electronic signatures to track. Elias reached for the main power controls, his movements careful and deliberate in the darkness. These were the final switches, the ones that would cut power to our propulsion systems, our ballast controls, our emergency communications. Once he threw these switches, we'd be completely helpless, drifting in a dead metal can, with no way to control our fate. "Ready?" he whispered, his hand hovering over the main power cutoff. I nodded, then realized he couldn't see me in the darkness. "Do it." The main power died with a soft electronic sigh. Every remaining system aboard our submarine went silent. The subtle electrical hums, the barely audible cooling fans, the whispered conversations between computer systems. Our technological heartbeat stopped completely. We were now drifting in absolute silence. The emergency buoyancy system activated automatically when main power failed, releasing compressed air into our ballast tanks, without any electronic controls or monitoring systems. I felt a subtle shift in our submarine's attitude as we began rising through the water column, but we had no way to measure our ascent rate or track our progress toward the surface. "Daddy, I'm scared." Katie's voice was definitely fainter now, as if the entity was losing its ability to target us without our acoustic signature. But the psychological assault continued, that relentless loop of manufactured fear designed to break Elias's mind. We sat motionless in the darkness, afraid to move, afraid to speak, afraid even to shift our weight in our seats. Every sound we made could potentially give away our position to the entity. Our breathing seemed impossibly loud in the silent cockpit, each exhale a potential beacon for the intelligence that hunted us through acoustic surveillance. Minutes passed in terrifying quiet. The familiar sounds of our submarine, the mechanical heartbeat that had sustained us for 18 hours in the deep ocean, were gone. We floated in a technological tomb, rising slowly through thousands of meters of water with no way to monitor our progress. The cold began seeping in almost immediately. Without power to run our heating systems, the crushing cold of the deep ocean started penetrating our hull. The metal around us conducted heat away from our bodies, turning our cockpit into a refrigerator that would slowly freeze us if our ascent took too long. "Daddy, where are you?" Katie's voice was growing more distant, the entity's psychological attack losing focus as we became acoustically invisible. But the manufactured fear in her voice still cut through Elias like a knife, each word a reminder of the emotional torture we'd endured. I pressed my hands against my ears, trying to block out the fading voices while we waited in darkness. My breathing was becoming more labored as our sealed air supply slowly degraded. Carbon dioxide was building up in our cabin without the scrubbers to remove it, and oxygen levels were dropping with each breath we took. The entity's voices continued for several more minutes, growing fainter and more confused. Katie's cries became intermittent, then sporadic, as if the intelligence was having trouble maintaining its psychological assault without acoustic targets to focus on. Then finally, the voices stopped completely. Silence surrounded us, not just the absence of the entity's torture, but the complete acoustic void of a dead submarine drifting through empty water. We'd become invisible to the intelligence that had nearly destroyed our minds, but the price was isolation in a metal coffin that might become our grave. Hours passed in the darkness. We couldn't check our depth, couldn't monitor our ascent rate, couldn't even know if we were rising or sinking. The emergency buoyancy system was supposed to bring us to the surface, but without instruments to confirm our progress, we could only trust in engineering and hope. The cold was becoming serious. My fingers were going numb despite the insulated gloves, and I could feel the chill penetrating my clothing. Elias's breathing had become shallow and rapid. Whether from cold or oxygen deprivation, I couldn't tell. Our air was definitely getting stale. Each breath felt less satisfying, and I could taste the metallic tang of carbon dioxide buildup. The scrubbers that normally cleaned our atmosphere were offline, leaving us to slowly poison ourselves with our own exhalations. I wanted to restart the life support systems, to bring back the familiar hum of circulation fans and the chemical whisper of oxygen generation. But any sound we made could potentially attract the entity's attention, could bring back the psychological torture that had nearly driven Elias to suicidal panic. We sat motionless in our technological tomb, afraid to move, afraid to speak, afraid even to breathe too loudly. Our only sounds were our own heartbeats and the barely audible whisper of our breathing, the most basic acoustic signatures of human life. The darkness was absolute. Without even emergency lighting, we existed in a void that pressed against our eyes like a physical weight. I couldn't see Elias sitting inches away from me, couldn't see my own hands when I held them in front of my face. Time became meaningless in the sensory deprivation of our silent ascent. Minutes felt like hours, and hours stretched into what seemed like days. We had no way to track our progress, no instruments to tell us how much farther we had to rise. My oxygen-starved mind began playing tricks on me. I thought I heard faint sounds, the distant hum of machinery, the whisper of voices, the mechanical heartbeat of our submarine systems. But when I listened more carefully, there was only silence and the sound of my own breathing. The cold was becoming dangerous. I could feel my core temperature dropping, my body's heat leaching away into the metal hull that surrounded us. Hypothermia would claim us long before we suffocated if our ascent took much longer. Elias shifted slightly in his seat, the first movement either of us had made in over an hour. The soft rustle of his clothing sounded impossibly loud in our silent tomb, and we both froze, listening for any sign that the entity had detected our presence. Nothing. Only the continued silence of our dead submarine rising through empty water. I closed my eyes, though it made no difference in the absolute darkness, and tried to calculate how much time had passed since we'd initiated the cold and dark procedure. 3 hours? 4? Without instruments or any reference points, time had become elastic and unreliable. Our air was definitely running out. Each breath required more effort, and the stale taste of carbon dioxide was becoming overwhelming. I could feel my heart working harder to pump oxygen-depleted blood through my body. But we couldn't risk restarting the life support systems. Not yet. Not until we were certain we'd escaped the entity's acoustic surveillance. The intelligence that had nearly broken our minds was still down there in the depths, waiting for any sound that would reveal our location. We could only trust in our emergency ascent and hope that the surface was close enough to reach before our air ran out completely. The darkness pressed against us like a living thing, and the silence stretched on forever. The first thing I felt was sunlight on my face. After 18 hours in the crushing darkness of the deep ocean, the sensation was so foreign that I couldn't process it immediately. Warmth touched my skin through the small porthole of our submarine, and somewhere in my oxygen-starved mind, I understood that we'd made it to the surface. Voices came next, real human voices, speaking in normal tones, not the synthesized horror that had nearly broken our minds. The rescue team from our support vessel was already alongside the Echo 1, their boat engines rumbling with mechanical sounds that belonged to the world of the living. Echo 1, this is Rescue Team Alpha. Can you hear us in there? The voice came through our hull, muffled but unmistakably human. No electronic manipulation, no psychological torture hidden in familiar inflections. Just a professional rescue coordinator doing his job. I tried to respond but found I couldn't speak. My throat felt raw and constricted, and my lungs burned with each shallow breath. The stale air in our cabin had become toxic over the hours of our silent ascent, and my body was struggling to function on the depleted oxygen. Elias stirred beside me in the darkness, his movement weak and unsteady. We'd been huddled together for warmth during the final hours of our ascent, sharing body heat as hypothermia crept through our disabled submarine. His breathing was as labored as mine, each exhale visible as a small cloud in the frigid air of our cockpit. "Can you activate your emergency beacon?" the rescue coordinator called through our hull. I wanted to explain that we couldn't risk making any electronic sounds, that the entity might still be listening, but my voice wouldn't work. The rational part of my mind knew we were safe on the surface, but the trauma of our acoustic torture ran deeper than logic. Elias reached for the emergency controls with trembling hands, his movement slow and uncertain in the darkness. The beacon activation switch was designed to be found by touch, but his fingers were numb from cold and oxygen deprivation. The beacon came alive with a sharp electronic chirp that made us both flinch. After hours of enforced silence, any sound felt like a betrayal, a signal that could draw the entity's attention back to us. But the chirp was followed by normal radio chatter from the rescue team, confirming our position and coordinating the recovery operation. "We've got them," someone said over the radio, "bringing them alongside now." The next few minutes passed in a blur of mechanical sounds and human activity. Rescue divers attached lifting cables to our submarine, while the support vessel maneuvered into position. The familiar noises of maritime operations, winches, engines, shouted instructions, felt surreal after our hours of terrified silence. When they finally opened our hatch, fresh air rushed into our cabin like a physical blow. I gasped and coughed as my lungs tried to process oxygen that wasn't poisoned with carbon dioxide. The rescue team's faces appeared in the opening, their expressions shifting from professional concern to alarm as they saw our condition. "Jesus," one of them muttered. "How long were they without life support?" Strong hands pulled us from our submarine and onto the deck of the support vessel. My legs wouldn't support my weight, and I collapsed onto the metal decking while rescue personnel swarmed around us. Someone wrapped a thermal blanket around my shoulders, but I couldn't stop shivering. Elias was in worse shape than me. His lips had a blue tinge that spoke of serious oxygen deprivation, and his eyes had the unfocused look of someone whose brain wasn't getting enough blood flow. The rescue team loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him toward the ship's medical bay. "Ma'am, can you tell us what happened down there?" one of the rescue coordinators asked, kneeling beside me on the deck. I tried to explain about the entity, about the impossible acoustic returns and the psychological torture, but the words came out as broken whispers. My throat was too damaged from the toxic air, and my mind was too scrambled from hypoxia to form coherent sentences. "Equipment failure," I managed to croak. "Had to go cold and dark." The coordinator nodded, making notes on his clipboard. Emergency ascent procedures were dangerous but not unprecedented. Submarines sometimes had to shut down all systems and rely on emergency buoyancy to reach the surface. Our condition was consistent with that explanation. They carried me to the medical bay on a stretcher, my body too weak to walk after hours of oxygen starvation and hypothermia. The ship's doctor was already working on Elias, monitoring his vital signs while warming blankets and oxygen masks worked to stabilize his condition. "Moderate hypoxia," the doctor reported to someone over the intercom. "Core temperature dropped to dangerous levels. They'll need several hours of observation." The medical bay felt impossibly bright after our hours in darkness. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the kind of normal electrical sound that had once been comforting but now made me flinch. Every mechanical noise, the oxygen concentrator, the heart monitor, the ventilation system, seemed threatening after what we'd experienced. They put me on oxygen and wrapped me in warming blankets, but I couldn't relax. My eyes kept darting around the medical bay, searching for threats that my rational mind knew weren't there. The entity was thousands of meters below us, trapped in the crushing depths where it belonged. But my nervous system hadn't gotten that message yet. Dr. Patterson arrived within an hour, his face creased with concern as he reviewed our medical charts. He'd been coordinating our mission from the surface, and our emergency ascent had clearly caught him off guard. "What happened down there?" he asked, pulling up a chair beside my medical bed. "Your last communication indicated normal survey operations." I tried to explain about the acoustic anomalies, about the entity that had learned to mimic our voices and torture us with our own family's words. But even as I spoke, I could see the skepticism growing in his eyes. The story sounded impossible, even to me. "Acoustic returns with 0 time delay," Patterson repeated, making notes. "Voice synthesis using your communication logs. Prediction of equipment failures." He was being polite, but I could tell he thought our experience was some kind of shared hallucination brought on by the extreme conditions. Nitrogen narcosis, oxygen toxicity, psychological pressure from the deep ocean environment. There were plenty of medical explanations for what we'd reported. "We have recordings," I said, my voice still hoarse from the toxic air. "Everything is documented in our mission database." Patterson nodded, but his expression remained skeptical. "We'll review all the data once you've recovered. Right now, focus on getting your strength back." Over the next several hours, they ran comprehensive medical tests on both of us. Blood work to check for decompression sickness, neurological exams to assess any brain damage from oxygen deprivation, psychological evaluations to determine our mental state. The results showed exactly what you'd expect from 2 people who'd spent hours in a disabled submarine: mild hypoxia, moderate hypothermia, and elevated stress hormones. But no evidence of the psychological trauma that had nearly driven us to madness. Elias recovered more slowly than I did. The oxygen deprivation had hit him harder, and he spent most of the first day sleeping under medical supervision. When he finally woke up, his first words were about Katie. "Is she okay?" he asked, his voice weak but urgent. "My daughter, is she safe?" The medical staff assured him that his family was fine, that Katie was healthy and happy at home with her mother. But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the lingering fear that the entity's psychological torture might have been based on real threats to his loved ones. The formal debriefing took place 2 days later, once we were both medically cleared and psychologically stable enough to give coherent testimony. Patterson led the session, accompanied by 2 mission specialists and a technical analyst who would review our equipment data. We sat in the ship's conference room, facing a panel of skeptical faces as we recounted our experience with the acoustic entity. I tried to present the information scientifically, focusing on the measurable anomalies and documented evidence rather than the emotional impact of the psychological torture. The initial acoustic returns showed impossible characteristics, I explained, referring to my notes. 0 time delay, perfect amplitude matching, no frequency dispersion. These readings violate basic principles of underwater sound propagation. The technical analyst nodded politely. "We've reviewed your equipment logs, Dr. Sharma. All systems show normal operation throughout the dive. No malfunctions, no anomalous readings, no evidence of the acoustic phenomena you've described." I felt my stomach drop. "That's impossible. We documented hours of anomalous returns. The data should be in our mission database." "The database shows normal survey operations," Patterson said, consulting his tablet. "Standard acoustic mapping, routine equipment function, normal communication logs. There's no record of the events you've described." Elias leaned forward in his chair, his face pale but determined. "What about the voice synthesis? The entity was using our family's voices against us. That has to be recorded somewhere." The analyst shook his head. Your communication logs show normal operational chatter and routine status reports. No voice synthesis. No family communications during the dive. No evidence of external acoustic manipulation. I stared at the panel in disbelief. Hours of documented evidence, comprehensive recordings of impossible acoustic phenomena, detailed logs of the entity's psychological torture. All of it was apparently gone from our mission database. The entity must have altered our data, I said, grasping for explanations. Somehow it corrupted our recording systems. Dr. Sharma, Patterson said gently, your equipment was functioning normally throughout the dive. The data logs are consistent and complete. There's no evidence of external tampering or system corruption. The debriefing continued for another hour, but the conclusion was inevitable. Our account of the acoustic entity was unsupported by any physical evidence. The mission specialists attributed our experience to a combination of psychological stress, equipment misinterpretation, and possible shared hallucination brought on by the extreme environment. Deep ocean conditions can cause unusual psychological effects, one of the specialists explained. Isolation, pressure, sensory deprivation, these factors can create vivid hallucinations that seem completely real to the subjects. They were professional and sympathetic, but their message was clear. We'd experienced some kind of psychological breakdown during our extended dive, and our memories of the acoustic entity were products of stressed minds rather than actual events. The official report classified our emergency ascent as the result of equipment concerns and environmental stress. No mention of impossible acoustic returns, no record of psychological torture, no acknowledgement that we'd encountered something beyond human understanding in the depths of the Puerto Rico Trench. 3 months later, I was working in an anechoic chamber at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, surrounded by sound-absorbing foam that eliminated every echo and reflection. The chamber was designed for acoustic research, but I'd requested assignment there for different reasons. I couldn't tolerate normal acoustic environments anymore. Every sound in the regular world felt threatening. The hum of air conditioning, the whisper of computer fans, the distant rumble of traffic. My nervous system had been rewired by our encounter with the entity, leaving me hypersensitive to any acoustic stimulus that might indicate intelligent manipulation. The anechoic chamber was my refuge. In the absolute silence of the foam-lined room, I could work without the constant fear that every sound might be evidence of the entity's presence. My colleagues thought I was suffering from some kind of acoustic trauma related to our emergency ascent, and I let them believe that explanation. It was easier than trying to convince them that something in the deep ocean had learned to weaponize sound itself. I spent my days analyzing acoustic data from other research missions, looking for any evidence of similar phenomena. Impossible echo returns, unexplained voice synthesis, acoustic anomalies that might indicate the presence of the entity or others like it. But every data set showed normal propagation characteristics, standard equipment function, routine scientific observations. Either we'd been the only ones to encounter the entity, or it was very good at hiding its presence from human detection systems. Elias had taken early retirement from submarine operations. The psychological trauma of hearing his daughter's voice used as a weapon had ended his career in deep-sea research. He'd moved his family to a rural area where the acoustic environment was simpler, more predictable, less likely to trigger the hypervigilance that now defined his daily existence. We stayed in contact through encrypted messages, sharing our ongoing research into acoustic anomalies and our attempts to understand what we'd encountered. But neither of us had found any evidence that supported our experience or explained the entity's capabilities. The official world had moved on, classifying our encounter as a psychological episode and filing our reports in databases that would never be seriously reviewed. The scientific community had no framework for understanding intelligence that could manipulate sound with impossible precision. but I knew what we'd experienced was real. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, 3 months after our encounter, I was reviewing our mission data one final time. The official investigators had declared the files clean and normal, but I wanted to examine every detail with the enhanced analysis tools available in my new laboratory. Most of the data was exactly as the investigators had reported: routine acoustic surveys, standard equipment function, normal operational procedures. But I had access to more sophisticated analysis software than the mission specialists had used. Tools that could extract information from data that appeared empty or corrupted. I was examining the final hours of our dive when I found something that made my hands start trembling. The audio logs from our silent ascent showed exactly what the investigators had reported: a flat line of perfect silence when all our systems were powered down. No equipment noise, no voice communications, no acoustic activity of any kind. But when I enhanced the subsonic frequencies, something appeared on my display that shouldn't have been there. A faint rhythmic pulse, barely detectable even with maximum amplification. 2 rapid patterns, synchronized but slightly different in frequency and timing. I stared at the waveform, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then recognition hit me like a physical blow. Heartbeats. 2 human heartbeats, recorded by our passive acoustic monitoring systems during our supposedly silent ascent. The equipment had been picking up the sound of our hearts beating in the darkness, documenting the most intimate acoustic signatures of our bodies. But there was something else in the enhanced audio. Underneath our 2 heartbeats, almost lost in the background noise, was a third rhythm. Slower, more deliberate, but perfectly synchronized with our cardiac patterns. Something had been listening to our hearts beating in the darkness. Something had been learning the rhythm of our most private biological functions, cataloging even those sounds we couldn't control or eliminate. The entity had never left us alone, even in what we thought was perfect silence. It had been there the entire time, listening to the sound of our fear. I saved the enhanced audio file to an encrypted drive and sat back in my chair, surrounded by the absolute silence of the anechoic chamber. The foam walls absorbed every reflection, every echo, creating a void that should have felt safe and protective. But now I understood that silence was an illusion. The entity was still down there in the depths, learning from every sound that reached its domain. Our encounter had been just one lesson in its comprehensive study of human acoustic patterns. It was building a library of our voices, our emotions, our most intimate sounds. And someday, it would use that knowledge again. I pulled off my headphones and sat in the perfect silence of my refuge, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Even here, surrounded by sound-absorbing foam and protected by layers of acoustic isolation, I couldn't escape the rhythm that had betrayed our presence to something that understood the language of the human heart. The entity was still listening, and it was still learning.